A white husky, broken and battered, stumbled out of the forest and collapsed on a porch he wasn't supposed to know. And inside that house, a little girl named Lily, who hadn't spoken in 143 days. What happened next was something no one could explain, but everyone who witnessed it would never forget. The wind howled through the pines like a voice mourning something long lost. Snow drifted silently from the slate-colored sky, layering the world in a soft, cold hush. It was the kind of morning where nothing stirred. No bird song, no footsteps, only the quiet creak of trees under winter's weight. The world had gone still. But beneath that stillness, something moved. A shape, pale against the snow yet trembling with life, emerged from the edge of the forest. A dog, large, white-coated with fur matted by ice and blood, his breath puffed in uneven clouds from a frostbitten muzzle. His paws, cracked and raw, left faint red marks behind him as he limped toward the only sign of warmth. A log cabin tucked at the base of the hill, chimney already smoking, windows glowing amber with firelight. The husky reached the porch steps but didn't climb them. He simply collapsed. A soft whimper escaped his throat, no louder than the wind, and then he lay still. Inside the cabin, Lily sat curled in an oversized chair by the hearth, her knees tucked to her chest, watching the fire with quiet eyes far too old for a 10-year-old girl. Her grandfather, grizzled and slow-moving, bustled in the kitchen behind her, humming tunelessly as he stirred oatmeal. The radio played a soft country song in the background, but Lily didn't hear it. She rarely heard anything these days, not since the accident. Not since the silence swallowed her voice. She hadn't spoken a word in 143 days. Something stirred in her chest just then. A flutter, like the ghost of a sound that hadn't reached her ears. She turned her head, eyes narrowing toward the window. "Lily," her grandfather called gently. "You want cinnamon in your—" But she was already on her feet, drawn toward the door by a sensation she couldn't name. She reached for the doorknob. "Hey now, what are you, Lily?" He followed her quickly, the spoon still in his hand. "Sweet pea, you can't just open the door like that. It's freezing out there." But she didn't stop, didn't even hesitate. The door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air that swept through the room like a ghost. Her grandfather moved to close it, but then froze. There, lying in the snow like some mythic creature from another world, was the husky. His white coat was streaked with mud, his sides rising and falling in shallow, painful breaths. One of his ears was torn. His ice-blue eyes, dulled by exhaustion, flicked upward toward them and held. Lily stepped forward. "Wait, hold on, we don't know where he came from, Lily!" But she was already at the dog's side, barefoot in the snow, kneeling beside him like she'd known him forever. She reached out with one trembling hand and placed it gently on his head. The moment her skin touched his fur, her lips parted. "His name," she whispered, the word brittle from disuse, almost too soft to hear. "His name is Echo." Her grandfather stood frozen on the porch, spoon dangling from his hand, breath catching in his throat. He hadn't heard her voice in months, not a single word, not even in her sleep. Now she knelt beside a dying animal, speaking with more certainty than he'd seen in her since the accident. "Lily," he said softly, Did you just say something?" But she wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on Echo's, those impossibly human eyes that seemed to hold stories of fire and snow and sorrow. She leaned in closer, whispering something only the dog could hear, and he responded with a faint flick of his tail, a single slow wag. "He found us," Lily said quietly. "He came looking." Her grandfather knelt beside her, placing a heavy, weathered hand on her back. The wind howled again through the trees, but inside that fragile moment, everything else went still. They didn't know yet who Echo was, or what he had endured to get there. But as Lily pressed her face against the dog's icy fur, something deep inside her, something long frozen, began to thaw. And from that single moment of connection, a story began. One of loss, healing, and a bond that would change everything. The old leather couch sagged beneath Echo's weight as Lily and her grandfather gently lifted him onto it, wrapping him in thick blankets warmed by the fire. His body trembled beneath the fabric, not from the cold now, but from exhaustion. The kind that sinks deep into the bones, the kind that says, "I've run too far, for too long." Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, her fingers working slowly, carefully, to clean the ice from Echo's fur. Her grandfather had tried to usher her back into her room to rest, to change out of her snow-soaked pajamas, but she refused to leave Echo's side. And he didn't push her. Not after what she'd said, not after she had spoken. Her voice, when it came, had been soft and breathless, but it had been real. That single word, Echo, had cracked the shell around her silence. And now, she sat beside this stranger dog like a soldier at a vigil, watching, protecting, listening. Her grandfather moved around them with quiet efficiency, bringing warm broth in a chipped ceramic bowl, a basin of water, and the old flannel sheets from the hall closet. He'd seen plenty of injured animals in his days as a forest ranger, but this was different. He could feel it. In the way Lily looked at the dog, in the way the dog looked back. "There's something about this one," he muttered under his breath, kneeling to examine Echo's wounds. "He's been through hell, Sha." His fingers traced over the scar along Echo's flank, a fresh gash, angry and red, not from a wild animal. No. This was clean, precise. A blade, maybe. Something man-made. He exhaled through his nose, concern tightening his jaw. "Where'd you come from, boy?" he murmured. Echo didn't answer, of course, but his blue eyes flicked toward him, then back to Lily, as if to say, "She's why I'm here." Lily looked up at her grandfather, her lips parted like she wanted to speak again, but no sound came. She simply reached into the folds of the blanket and rested her hand over Echo's heart. Beneath it, his heartbeat thudded slow, steady, fading into sleep. Later that night, long after her grandfather had dozed off in his armchair, Lily remained awake. The fire had dimmed to a soft amber glow, shadows dancing on the log walls around them. She curled beside Echo now, her head resting against his side. His breathing was steadier. She could feel it rise and fall beneath her cheek like waves against the shore. She didn't remember falling asleep, but at some point during the night, she began to dream. In the dream, she stood in the middle of a pine forest blanketed in snow. The moon hung low and full, casting silver light on every branch. Echo stood before her, taller than in real life, majestic, almost ethereal. His fur shimmered like frost under moonlight. He turned his head, beckoning her silently, then began to walk. She followed. They came to a clearing. In the center stood a cabin, charred black, its roof collapsed inward. Smoke rose faintly from the ruins, and there, amid the rubble, a voice cried out. A girl's voice, young, frightened. Lily moved to run toward it, but Echo stopped her. He looked up at her, and in his eyes, she saw memories. A fire, screams, a door slammed shut, and the sound of someone crying for help, someone whose voice cracked like ice under pressure. Then the dream shifted. Echo lay beside her again, but this time he was different. Younger, healthier, and beside him stood a girl. Not Lily, but someone who looked familiar. Lily awoke with a jolt, the blankets around her tangled. Echo stirred but didn't lift his head. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding. The dream lingered in her mind like fog on glass, half-formed but heavy with meaning. "Who are you?" she whispered. Echo opened his eyes. For a moment they seemed too old for any dog, like he remembered things no animal should. Then he licked her hand and placed his paw gently over hers. In the following days, Lily barely left his side, Her grandfather called Dr. Owens, the local vet, who came out to the cabin and confirmed what they already knew. The dog had suffered frostbite, dehydration, and a shallow knife wound. He was lucky to be alive. The vet administered antibiotics and checked for a microchip, but the scan turned up nothing. "He's not registered. No collar either," Dr. Owens said, scratching his beard. "Hard to say where he came from, but someone had him. He's too well trained to be wild." He looked at Lily, who was brushing Echo's ears gently. "He's bonded to her," the vet added softly. "Whatever happened to him out there, he came to the right place." Her grandfather nodded. "Yeah, I think he did." That evening, Lily brought her notebook to the couch. She still wasn't ready to speak out loud, not to anyone else, but the pencil moved easily in her hand. She wrote, "Echo is dreaming again. So am I." She turned the page. "He remembers a girl, a fire. I think he's trying to tell me something." Her grandfather read over her shoulder in silence. Then he put a hand on her back. "Maybe he is, Lilybug. Maybe he is." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin something had shifted, not just in Echo's recovery, but in Lily's soul. The silence that had claimed her for months was beginning to melt, and though she couldn't quite explain it, she knew that Echo hadn't come to them by chance. He had come with a purpose, and whatever it was, it had only just begun. The storm broke 2 nights later. The sky cracked open with a roar, sending snow and wind in furious spirals across the pines. The little cabin groaned beneath the weight of it. Icicles clinked against the window panes like glass wind chimes gone mad. Inside, the fire roared and the world shrank to the flickering light of the hearth. Lily lay curled under a quilt on the couch, her sketchbook open on her lap. Echo's head rested gently on her feet, his breath steady, his eyes half-lidded but never fully asleep. He hadn't taken his gaze off her since the night of the dream. Her drawings had changed. Once just childish doodles of trees and animals, now they had become something else, almost journalistic. A broken cabin. A girl standing in the woods, calling for help. A dog, Echo, sprinting through fire, his fur catching sparks. She didn't understand what she was drawing, not really. It was like the images were memories that didn't belong to her, but lived inside her hand just the same. Her grandfather watched quietly from his rocking chair, a mug of tea cooling in his hands. He'd stopped asking questions. Some part of him, maybe the same part that once trusted the forest to guide him when maps failed, knew something bigger was happening. That night, long after he went to bed, Lily woke with a start. No sound, just a pull. She sat upright, the dream already fading but leaving behind one vivid detail. Echo, standing in the woods, looking back at her with urgency in his eyes. Her breath clouded in the cold room. The fire had burned low. Echo was gone. The blanket where he had been was empty, still warm to the touch. Lily slid off the couch, her bare feet whispering across the wooden floor. She found the front door cracked open just enough to let in the wind. He had left. Not run, not escaped, but left with purpose. She knew that with the same certainty that told her what his name was. He was leading her, calling her, trusting her to follow. She didn't even stop to think. She pulled on her coat, boots, mittens, her grandfather's heavy flashlight, and stepped into the storm. The cold bit hard, but she didn't feel it. Her legs carried her over the porch, down the steps and into the trees. The path wasn't marked, and snow blanketed the ground in deep white drifts, but she knew where to go. There were paw prints, barely visible, but there. Echo's trail. She followed. The woods were silent, snow muting every sound. Trees bowed beneath the wind's weight. Branches cracked above her. Still, she walked. Through thickets and over half-frozen creeks, through shadows that twisted with the wind. The flashlight beam danced ahead of her, catching the occasional glint. Paw prints, a patch of fur on a low branch, a broken twig. And then she saw him. Echo stood still in the middle of a clearing, his head lifted toward the trees, his breath clouding the air. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze, then looked down at the ground. Lily stepped closer, breathless. Before her, half buried in snow and pine needles, lay the blackened remains of a small cabin. Charred beams poked from the snow like broken bones. The scent of old ash and wet wood hung in the air, even after all this time. A portion of the stone fireplace still stood, jagged but upright. Lily's heart pounded in her ears. She didn't know this place, but some part of her did. Echo walked slowly to what remained of the doorway and sat, eyes on her, waiting. She followed, her boots crunching softly in the snow. There, near the fireplace, something glinted, half buried in ash and ice, a small metal object. Lily knelt, brushing it off. A heart-shaped locket, the kind worn by children. She turned it over. The back was scratched and worn, but 2 letters remained. KJ. The metal burned cold in her palm, even through her mittens. She stared at it, heart pounding. Her vision blurred, not from tears, but from sudden, overwhelming emotion. This belonged to someone, a little girl. She was here. Echo came to her side, nudging her arm with his nose. She looked into his eyes and felt it all over again. That strange, impossible sensation that he was remembering. That he had seen it, lived it. The fire, the screams, the girl, her name. It was almost on the tip of Lily's tongue. She clutched the locket tighter. Behind her the trees rustled, soft, distant. A breath of wind or a memory passing by. She turned slowly, afraid the clearing would vanish, that the world would snap back into ordinary time and this dreamlike moment would be gone. But it didn't. She was still there, still kneeling in the snow beside a dog who shouldn't know this place, who shouldn't remember what he clearly did. Echo lifted his muzzle and howled, not loud, not long, but deep. A sound soaked in grief and longing and something else. Loyalty. A cry for someone lost. A promise kept. The wind carried them home. Lily didn't remember walking back through the forest. Her fingers were numb, her legs unsteady, and the locket burned cold in her coat pocket. But Echo stayed at her side the whole way, pressing close when she stumbled, waiting when she hesitated, leading her through the dark like a thread through a needle's eye. The lights from the cabin flickered in the distance just as the storm began to ease. The wind softened to a breath, and snowflakes fell gently now, no longer fierce, but like whispered apologies from the sky. Her grandfather was already on the porch, coat thrown over his flannel pajamas, flashlight clutched tightly in his shaking hand. When he saw them emerge from the trees, he didn't shout, didn't scold. He just exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and opened his arms. Lily ran to him, burying her face in his chest. He didn't ask questions, not right away. He carried her inside, bundled her in blankets, made her hot cocoa the way her mother used to, with cinnamon and the tiniest marshmallows. Echo lay at her feet, his head resting on her slippered toes, his eyes fixed on her like a sentinel. After the fire had been stoked and the warmth returned to her fingers, she reached into her coat and pulled out the locket. She placed it gently in her grandfather's palm. He turned it over, squinting at the faded engraving. KJ. He looked up, his brow furrowed. "Where did you find this, sweetheart?" Lily hesitated, then opened her notebook and wrote one line. "Echo showed me." He didn't scoff, didn't laugh. He just looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The old burned cabin?" he asked. She nodded. He rubbed a hand down his face, the way he did when something heavy settled on him. "I haven't thought about that place in years." He rose, disappearing into the hallway. When he returned, he carried a dusty photo album. He set it beside her on the table and flipped carefully through yellowed pages until he stopped at a photo of a young girl, no older than Lily, grinning at the camera with wind-tousled hair and a scraped chin. A white dog, Echo, or one that looked so much like him it stole Lily's breath, sat beside her. "That's Katie Jameson," he said quietly. "Lived with her parents in a rental cabin just past the ridge. Good family. Moved up from the city. Wanted to start fresh. She was kind. The kind of kid who would chase butterflies just to whisper to them." He turned the page. There were more photos. Katie playing in the snow, Katie holding a book, Katie hugging that same white dog. They didn't stay long. Winter hit hard that year. The cabin wasn't built for the cold. There was a fire. Electrical, they said. Middle of the night. Her parents got out. He paused, voice catching. But Katie didn't. Lily's throat tightened. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. "No one could find the dog after that," her grandfather continued. "Assumed he'd perished, too. But now..." He looked down at Echo. "You're not supposed to be real," he said softly. "You're not supposed to be here." Echo looked back at him, silent and steady. Lily reached for her notebook again. He was waiting for her, but she never came. Her grandfather read the words, then swallowed hard. "Is that what he told you?" She nodded. Later that night, while her grandfather slept in his chair, the locket resting beside him on the table, Lily crept into her room and curled up beneath the quilt. Echo followed, of course. He always did now. She could feel the grief rising inside her again. Not just her own, but something larger, heavier. A sadness that didn't have a clear beginning or end. When she closed her eyes, the dreams returned. This time, she was inside the burning cabin. The flames crawled up the walls and the air was thick with smoke. She could hear someone coughing, a child's voice, scared and thin. Then came the barking. Echo again, but younger, his fur unscorched, his body lean and strong, was at the girl's side, pulling her sleeve, trying to drag her toward the door. But something blocked the way. A beam had fallen. The heat was too intense. The girl dropped to her knees, coughing hard. She whispered something to Echo, kissed his head, and shoved him through a small broken window. He didn't want to go, but she pushed him one last time. And then he ran. Lily woke sobbing. The dream had been so vivid, so real, she could still smell the smoke in her hair. Echo rested his head on her chest, his eyes sorrowful. "You tried," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You tried to save her." It was the first full sentence she had spoken aloud in months. Echo looked at her with eyes too full of knowing. And then Lily understood something she hadn't before. He hadn't come to forget. He had come to remember, to carry her story, to finish what he had been unable to do, and maybe, just maybe, to find peace in the one child who would listen. The snow had stopped falling by morning, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than ever. Lily stood at the edge of the forest, the pale sun rising behind her in a hazy blur. The air was sharp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and smoke. In her gloved hand, she clutched the locket tightly. KJ, its faded metal pressing into her palm like a secret refusing to stay buried. Echo stood beside her, motionless. His breath hung in the air, slow and visible, and Lily could feel the weight of his body leaning slightly into hers, just enough to let her know, "You're not alone." Her grandfather had agreed to return to the clearing. He hadn't said much that morning, only brewed her tea and packed a thermos of coffee for himself. But she saw it in his eyes. The quiet conviction of someone who finally believed in things they once thought were too painful to face. They hiked back through the forest, the trail easier now that the storm had passed. Every so often, Lily would glance back at Echo, who followed without a sound, his eyes locked ahead, his steps unhurried but certain. When they reached the ruins, the world felt as if it were holding its breath. The burned cabin still stood in its skeletal way, half hidden beneath snow and shadow, but the place no longer felt forgotten. It felt witnessed. Lily moved slowly to the center of the clearing and knelt beside the collapsed hearth. She didn't have a plan, not really. Just a feeling, a truth pressing against her chest, needing to be spoken. She opened the locket and stared at the tiny photograph inside. A girl with dark braids and eyes full of joy, frozen in time. Katie, the girl from her dreams, the girl Echo had once loved. "She saved you," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Echo walked up beside her and sat down. She could feel the tension in his body, the way his ears flicked and his chest rose in a long, slow breath. "She made you leave, and you've been looking for her ever since." Tears prickled in Lily's eyes. The forest, the silence, even the light, all seemed to bend around this moment. I think she wants you to stop looking," Lily said softly. "Because she's already with you. She never left you behind. She sent you to me." The locket slipped from her hand and landed on the snow with a soft thunk. For a long moment, no one moved. And then Echo tilted his head back and howled. It wasn't the lonely, searching howl of a dog lost in the woods. It wasn't the desperate cry she had heard in her dream. This was different. This howl was full of longing, yes, but also release. It rose through the trees like a hymn, a farewell, a prayer. It was goodbye. Lily covered her mouth with her mittened hand, tears spilling freely now. Her grandfather stood a few feet behind her, head bowed, his hand pressed to his heart. When Echo's howl faded, the forest stayed still. Snowflakes drifted lazily from tree branches. Somewhere far away, a raven cawed once and fell silent again. And then, Echo collapsed. Not suddenly, not violently, just gently. He lay down in the snow as if settling in for a nap. His breath came slower now, and his body didn't tremble like it had the night he'd arrived. He seemed calm, peaceful. His eyes found Lily's, and in them she saw gratitude, love, and something more, something ancient and deep. Forgiveness. She crawled to him, burying her face into his thick fur. "No," she whispered through sobs. "Please, not yet." Echo gave one soft exhale, a breath that was almost a sigh, and closed his eyes. His chest rose, fell, and didn't rise again. Lily stayed there for a long time, her small body curled beside his, the snow melting where it touched his still warm coat. She didn't move, didn't speak, just cried in silence. Tears for Echo, for Katie, for all the words left unspoken and all the love that had somehow found its way through time and tragedy. Her grandfather came eventually, wrapping his arms around her, whispering words she couldn't hear over the sound of her grief. Together, they carried Echo home. They buried him beneath the tall pine near the edge of the woods, the place where the first light always touched the snow. The place Echo had looked toward every morning as if waiting for someone. They laid the locket beside him, tucked gently beneath his paw. Lily painted a wooden marker with his name, Echo. She didn't add dates. She didn't need to. Some souls are timeless. After the burial, Lily didn't speak for 3 days. Not out of grief, not because she was lost, but because there were no words big enough to carry what Echo had given her. When she finally did speak, it was to her grandfather on a quiet evening, the fire casting golden light across the cabin. "He found me," she said simply. Her grandfather looked up from his book. "What do you mean?" Lily smiled, her voice steady now. "Echo. He came because I needed him. Because I forgot how to feel safe. How to be brave." "And now?" her grandfather asked. She nodded slowly. "Now I remember." He reached out and took her hand. "You gave him peace, Lily." She looked toward the window where the snow was beginning to fall again. "No," she said softly. "We gave each other peace." Outside, the wind stirred the pine boughs gently, and for a moment, Lily swore she heard it again. A single, distant howl. But this time, it wasn't calling. It was answering. The weeks that followed Echo's passing moved slowly, like snow melting into spring, quiet, hesitant, but sure. The forest softened as the days lengthened, and the cabin breathed again. Sunlight stretched longer across the pine floors, and birdsong returned to the trees. The deep, aching stillness that had settled over Lily began to loosen its grip. It didn't vanish, not entirely, but it no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a presence, a memory living just beneath her ribs. Grief had become a companion, not loud, not cruel, just ever there. She visited Echo's grave every morning before breakfast, sitting cross-legged beside the tall pine, whispering stories into the wind, about school, about her dreams, about the rabbit she saw hopping by the creek. She didn't need to hear a reply to know he was listening. Sometimes, when she lay in bed at night, she would feel something warm brush against her feet, like a familiar nudge. And once, in the early hours before dawn, she could have sworn she heard paws pacing the hallway outside her room. She smiled when it happened, because she knew some goodbyes don't mean the end. One quiet Saturday in early spring, her grandfather returned from town with a flyer tucked into the pocket of his coat. He laid it on the kitchen table without a word. Lily picked it up and stared. Rescue Dog Adoption Day, Saturday, March 18th, Alder Creek Shelter. She didn't speak right away. Her grandfather gave her space. "You don't have to go," he said gently. "But I thought, well, maybe you'd like to meet some of the pups." Lily didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. But her fingers lingered on the paper. And that night, she placed it on the windowsill in her room, where moonlight caught the edges and made it glow like a quiet invitation. When the day came, the shelter buzzed with energy. Children laughing, dogs barking, volunteers greeting families with clipboards and hopeful smiles. The scent of shampooed fur and fresh kibble hung in the air. Lily stayed close to her grandfather's side, her hand tight in his. They passed kennel after kennel of tail-wagging dogs, eager eyes, playful barks. They were all beautiful, but none of them were him. She wasn't looking for another Echo. She knew he couldn't be replaced, but still, something inside her waited for a feeling, a spark. And then, just as they were about to leave, a young woman in a Navy volunteer vest approached. "We have one more," she said. "He's in the back, a bit shy. His siblings were adopted weeks ago, but he hasn't really connected with anyone yet." Lily's chest tightened. "We're not rushing anything," her grandfather said kindly, "but we'll meet him." They followed the volunteer to a quiet room away from the noise. And there he was, a German Shepherd pup, all oversized ears and big, watchful eyes. He sat in the far corner, not moving, not barking, just staring. His fur was a little darker than Echo's had been, and his legs still wobbled from growth. But there was something about him, something still. Lily didn't approach. She sat on the floor, cross-legged, just like she had with Echo that first night. And she waited. The puppy blinked at her, sniffed the air. Then slowly, step by cautious step, he came forward. When he reached her, he pressed his small body into her lap and sighed. Deep, content, as if he had found something he'd been searching for. Tears sprang to her eyes, not of sadness, but recognition. Her grandfather knelt beside her, voice barely a whisper. "Do you want to name him?" She looked down at the puppy nestled into her coat. His heartbeat thudded against her palm. "Whisper," she said softly. The name fell from her lips like a promise, At home, Whisper settled into life with a gentleness that surprised them all. He followed Lily everywhere, silent, observant, as if reading the world through her eyes. He never barked at loud noises, never growled at strangers. But if Lily felt afraid, he would stand in front of her like a tiny guardian. And sometimes, late at night, he would sit at the window, ears perked, staring out into the trees, like he was listening for something, or someone. One evening, Lily curled in bed, Whisper at her side. She reached beneath her pillow and pulled out the notebook she had filled with drawings of Echo, sketches of the burned cabin, of Katie's face, of her and Echo walking side by side through the forest. She turned to a blank page and began to draw. This time, it was Whisper. His ears were still too big, his paws too floppy, but his eyes, those eyes, carried something older than he should have known. When she finished, she whispered into the quiet, "Are you still with us, Echo?" Whisper raised his head, ears twitching. Then he did something he had never done before. He howled, just once. Just a single, soft, trembling note that echoed gently through the room like a memory returned. Lily pressed her hand to his head, tears welling in her eyes. "I knew it," she whispered. "He's teaching you, isn't he?" Whisper's tail thumped once. That night, she dreamed of the woods again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Echo walked beside her, his fur glowing silver in the moonlight. Whisper ran just ahead, bounding through the snow with joy, and Katie stood in the distance, waving. She wasn't sad anymore. Neither was Echo. As they turned to walk deeper into the dream, Lily heard a voice, not a whisper, not a cry, but something soft and strong, like the hum of a heart that had been broken and healed all at once. Some bonds never break. They just become part of who we are. Lily woke smiling, because now she knew the truth. Echo wasn't gone. He had simply become part of her story, forever. If you believe that some dogs are more than companions, if you believe they come into our lives with purpose, then maybe, just maybe, Echo was never lost. He was always meant to find her. Just like some stories were always meant to find you. What did this story stir in your heart? Did it remind you of a pet you've loved? Or a bond you can't explain? Share your story in the comments. We read them all. And if this tale touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a little warmth today. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay kind, and never stop believing in second chances.